Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are joining us from today for this very important and timely event entitled Tariffs and Trade in the Wake of a New Trump Administration. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, and I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs here in Waterloo, Canada. Before I introduce our eminent guests, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Balsillie School is situated on the Haldeman Track. It's the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. This land is the traditional territory of the Arawandara, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples who have cared for this land for time immemorial. We're grateful for the opportunity to work on this land and collaborate and recognize the enduring presence and contributions of Indigenous peoples in shaping the social, cultural, and economic landscape of this region. I want to thank our eminent guest speakers who have taken time to speak with us today. Dr. Patricia Goff is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University here in Waterloo. She is the co-lead of the Balsillie School's Global Political Economy Research Cluster. Dr. Goff specializes in international political economy, international relations theory, and international organization, with a particular interest in trade and the culture capacity of international organizations. Dr. John Hancock works at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, where he served as Senior Policy Advisor to the Director General, representative to the IMF and World Bank, and the Head of Policy Development. He spearheaded the launch of the WTO's Aid for Trade initiative, as well as recent joint initiatives on investment facilitation and other emerging issues. Prior to joining the World Trade Organization, he was the senior advisor to Canada's Trade Minister. Dr. Bob Koopman is currently the Hearst Senior Professorial Lecturer at the American University School of International Service. His research focuses on the impact of trade and trade policy on economic development and growth. Bob previously served as the chief economist of the World Trade Organization and an adjunct professor of economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Dr. Miguel Angel Santos is the Dean of the School of Government and Public Transformation at Monterrey University in Mexico. He's an expert in public development policies and the author of many books and articles. He worked at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he was the director of applied research at the Harvard Growth Lab. He's led multidisciplinary teams in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East to assist governments in their growth and development strategies. A warm welcome to all of you today. Thank you for joining us at the Balsillie School. I've got a number of questions for you all, and I would like to start by talking about the role of tariffs and why they are back in vogue. John Hancock, can you take this one on?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm going to start with an irony that we're all talking about tariffs as a kind of the weapon of choice in modern trade warfare, and yet they're some of the oldest tools in the book. The Athenians were levying tariffs on grain imports back in the 4th century BC, and I'm sure city-states and empires were doing it long before that. And I think it's also ironic, and Bob would attest to this. In the WTO not so long ago, tariffs were passé. They were kind of a relic of history, and everyone was talking about regulations and non-tariff measures as being the frontier of trade policy. So to suddenly find ourselves back in a world of tariffs seems like a kind of a back to the future moment. And I'd also add that most economists would agree that tariffs are generally, as a policy instrument, self-defeating, and they don't really increase growth or welfare. So it can at least that question: why are we here? I think we all know what the purpose of tariffs are. They generate revenues. They are ways of restricting imports and thereby protecting domestic industries, and they're kind of reciprocal bargaining tools, a way of sort of exercising leverage to get others to do what you want them to do. But I don't think that's the main reason that they're being used right now. I think the main reason is that they have political visibility, and in a way that more subtle instruments or even more effective instruments don't. I mean, we are in an age where economic policy is being weaponized. and not just by the US and not just by this administration. It's a general trend we're seeing globally, not a great trend. And in this array of weapons, the tariff is like a shotgun. It's obvious. It produces shock and awe. That's why we're here talking. It's measurable. It's like building a wall. And I think it has that attraction to the administration. That's
Can I just push a little bit more? What's shaping U.S. trade policy and what's driving persistent U.S. trade deficits?
That's a really good question. So I think, again, to try to condense, it's a really big subject, but I think the thing to start with is that there has been a shift in U.S. foreign and trade policy, quite a dramatic shift. And again, I think it's fair to say this shift did not begin under this administration. The shift has been happening for at least the last decade, and it's traceable through the Biden administration, the first Trump administration. There were glimmers of it during the Obama administration. And I think there's at least two main things that have driven the shift. And it's a shift away from something that had lasted for the best part of a century, at least since the Second World War. And this was this idea that U.S. leadership and U.S. foreign policy was guided by the idea that to secure American prosperity and security, you had to secure the prosperity and security of others. And out of that vision, out of the kind of post-war vision, you see trade as a tool of spreading growth. You see economic interdependence as a way of giving countries a stake in each other's success. You see rules and new institutions as a way of injecting security and fairness into international relations. It's kind of a positive sum view of the world based on economic cooperation versus a zero-sum view of the world based on economic nationalism. And that's what kind of guided U.S. policy from GATT right up, I'd say, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So something changes. I think the first major change was the financial crisis and the recession and disruption and unemployment and growing inequality that followed from that. It's a lot of people started asking themselves, is globalization a tide that lifts all boats? And increasingly people said, no, it's not. We're getting left behind. That's a contentious question, but I think the financial crisis is a turning point. And the other major turning point, which it paradoxically arises from this, it's kind of enlightened self-interest of the United States, is the rise of China and its emergence as a huge, economic and security peer competitor. And again, people ask themselves about globalization, how good is globalization if it's driving the rise of our number one geopolitical competitor? So there's this shift. And I think for this administration, both of these seismic shifts are in a way embodied and reflected in this obsession or a focus on trade deficits. I think from the administration's perspective, a trade deficit is a measurable sign of how others are stealing from you or taking from you, taking your jobs, taking your technologies, taking your factories. It's again a zero-sum view. And tariffs are a way of punishing the stealers, taking things back, and readjusting the balance sheet. I think it's the trade balancing is a kind of an E-Day fix with the administration. And you have President Trump saying things like, am I going to be able to find this? He says, I'm not going to find it. It's an meaningless quote. Anyway, I think the problem with this is, and I'm going to just try to wrap it up here. The problem is I don't think it solves the tariff focus solves any of these key problems. It isn't an ideal solution to inequality and poverty. In fact, while you can shield a few workers or select workers, you actually make everyone poorer because they're paying more for everything: fuel, food, consumer imports. You're driving up inflation, you're raising the cost of living. I don't think that you'd be hard pressed to find many examples in history where protecting companies from competition actually makes them more competitive. Just the opposite. It tends to make them less innovative, less efficient, more dependent on future protection. And even, if certain industries are protected, you kind of harm or hurt all the other downstream industries that are dependent on those low-cost inputs to produce globally competitive products. And you know, a good example, you know, people point to the steel industry in the US, where you have sort of like somewhere in the vicinity of 500,000 workers are still engaged in the steel industry, or maybe 700,000, but you have 10 million workers who are dependent on, you know, competitively priced steel. So a tariff on steel might do a very good job of adding another 100,000 workers, but you risk 10 million being lost. And this brings me to, I just want to, my last point. I think when you say what's a driver of these trade deficits, I think the biggest problem with the obsession on trade policy to correct trade deficits is it ignores the fact that much of the US trade deficit, and I know Bob has thought a lot about this, much of the US trade deficit is not driven by trade, but is driven by macroeconomic factors. So you're focusing on subsidies, tariffs, regulations, when in reality, the basic problem is the US consumes too much and saves too little, and China saves too much and consumes too little. And as long as that giant macroeconomic balance exists, there is going to be a trade deficit. And it's not clear that anything short of either dramatically reducing the exchange rate value of the dollar compared to the Chinese yen, radically reducing your consumption or reducing your investment would solve that problem. And in fact, it's not even clear that that's a problem you'd want to solve at this point in time.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Bob. Are there valid concerns in the United States about national economic security and the perceived role that trade has played in undermining it?
So the short answer is yes, there are some valid concerns, I think, about the U.S. circumstances for national economic security. The role of trade, though, I think is a little bit more complex here. So, and you know, this comes down, I think, to sort of a realist view of international relations versus a liberal view of international relations. And I think the Trump administration has a very much a realist view, as John was saying. I agree with many of the points John was making, by the way. They're very good ones. You know, that it's a zero-sum game out there. The ironic thing is, it probably makes some national security sense to decouple to some extent from China, or to diversify your sources of supply for various reasons, okay? I think that applies to many countries. When you look at what happened in COVID-19, the lesson there isn't to bring everything back to the home country. It's to think about having more diverse potential sources of supply for various goods, so that if something shuts down one place, you know, you can open up somewhere else, or you know, increase your imports from somewhere else. I think the ironic thing with the Trump administration is they are very much looking at this protected island of the US, as opposed to how do we work with like-minded countries? How do we create alliances? How do we help developing countries build up their capacity to be alternative suppliers? And I think that's the real sad perspective for me, that it's become this isolationist view of how to solve these problems, which, by the way, doesn't solve them. There's a black powder factory that is very critical for military production in the United States. It had a fire. And it was offline for an extended period of time. It was the only black powder facility in the United States. You know, so even if you have it domestically, it doesn't give you that resilience that you need in order to bring about what you might consider to be greater national economic security. Now, the better liberal approach, I think, would be to think about, well, okay, we want to diversify our sources. How do we use that diversification with our own old mindset, as John was articulating, that we're safer if the rest of the world is rising also, right? That if they're experiencing economic growth, if they're having opportunities, and we provide those market opportunities. So that's my view. I do think, I don't think trade really played the major role in undermining it. Let me try to close with this. I think there were more macroeconomic forces in the United States resulting in a shift of resources The fact that trade was available to outsource and offshore was just one element. In the United States, investment, employment was being driven to these other sectors. We've been at full employment. We've had pretty much full capacity utilization. We've been sucking in capital from the rest of the world and using that capital. We've had reasonably rapid economic growth for an advanced market economy. It has not been distributed very, very equitably. That goes back before the great financial crisis. That probably brought it to people's mind. But those challenges are domestic, not so much a result of the international trade system. Contributed some, but not the solution to the problem, blowing it up. The solution is to think about how you calibrate your domestic economic policies and direct resources to more either equitable distribution or distribution that meets your national economic security requirements. That's my point there. I want to make one other comment. John's so right about the macro side. And his point that tariffs are like the big show. I had a conversation once when I was at the WTO with a U.S. Treasury representative, a former U.S. Treasury representative, and he was saying, look, tariffs, the president can do something. Rebalancing the macro economy, nobody sees that. Nobody really understands that. Tariffs are something you can do. And we now have a president who's a showman. He wants to be visible and he wants to be seen as powerful. And there's this tool, the EPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, that allows him to act quickly. And Congress does not seem to be in the mood to,
put up a fight
from happening. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, let me stay with you for one more question, because I want to look at the impact of the tariffs.
Yeah.
Really quickly, what are the expected initial economic effects on the U.S. economy from Trump tariffs? And perhaps a couple of words about the knock-on effects from the initial effects.
Sure. So, trade is a relatively small share of our GDP. The direct effects are small. Less than 1% of GDP for sure. My analysis suggests it's more in the lines of about 0.5%. If there's retaliation, it goes up a bit. The bigger effects, Canada and Mexico, their effects are 2 or 3 times the size of the negative effects on the US. And if they retaliate, which then increases the cost to the US, it also increases the cost to Canada and Mexico. And the disruptive effects will be that there'll be all this reallocation of what is currently fully employed labor and capital. Suddenly we'll be rushing to produce lots of things like textiles and apparel we don't produce much of. Well, there'll be incentives for firms to try to start producing that stuff, right? The same with assembling electronic goods and stuff like that. They will compete for labor. They will compete for capital. That will drive up the price of labor and capital, particularly if we're deporting up to 7 million workers. That'll be concentrated in certain sectors. So though I don't think it's the tariff effects that are very inflationary. It'll be uncomfortable. Households won't like that. I think it'll be the factor market impacts that are downstream that are likely to make the Fed worry about inflation and start driving up costs across many different products, even if they're not facing tariffs or if they use imported parts and components. We'll have reduced economies of scale. We'll have less diversity, and we'll have less technological spillovers, by the way. All of those things add up and would magnify those initial effects that I just described.
Great, thank you. Patty, over to you. What might be the impact in Canada if the tariffs are implemented? Talk to us about the Canadian perspective.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's great to be part of this conversation today. It's hard to say with precision. I think both John and Bob have outlined some of the typical consequences that we associate with tariffs. And obviously, we can expect those things to happen in Canada. We don't have great historical comparisons. Of course, people are looking at the first Trump administration's targeted tariffs on steel and aluminum to see if there's a comparison there. It's imperfect. I think a lot of people are thinking once again about the Nixon shock, also an imperfect comparison. So history is only so helpful in making these predictions. That being said, we're seeing lots of economists doing some very interesting modeled predictions and projections on where the impacts might be. I think, let's see what we've got here. The Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada has said that Canadian GDP growth will likely decline by 2.5% in the first year if we have 25% tariffs across the board. Of course, it's hard to know what to model because we're not quite sure what is coming. But I think we're seeing a lot of modeling of worst case scenarios. And the worst case scenario that we know of right now, of course, is 25% across the board. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has said something similar. RBC has suggested that 25% tariffs across the board could reduce Canadian GDP by as much as 4.5% over 2 years. So these are sobering numbers. Of course, there are job loss numbers that are being predicted, concentrated perhaps in Ontario and Alberta, but not limited to those provinces. Certainly the energy industry and the automotive industries that are concentrated there have the lion's share of jobs associated with exports to the US market. There could be a decline in investment. The value of the dollar will decline likely. So I think there are concerted efforts to try and game this out to help with planning. But I do think it's worth putting another question on the table, and that is perhaps in the wake of our most recent indicator from Howard Lutnick last evening, that suggests that perhaps once again things could be postponed. I think we also have to ask ourselves, what is the impact of the uncertainty about whether and when the tariffs might be implemented? Because I think that's arguably, as time passes, that is arguably as significant as actual tariffs.
Mm. And there's been a lot of commentary also on CUSMA or USMCA renegotiations. So what can we expect from these renegotiations?
So CUSMA is a distinctive trade agreement in the sense that a review is required. So written into the agreement, as many know, is a formal review every 6 years. It went into force in 2020, so we're due for a review in 2026. I think it is, no one expects that to be a rubber stamp. I think we expect that to be a reopening of the agreement and an opportunity for all parties to think about what can happen, but certainly for the Trump administration to push hard on longstanding irritants and some newer irritants. I think we'll certainly see among the longstanding irritants some efforts on supply management, and in particular the tariff-free quota allocation that restricts the access of U.S. dairy into the Canadian market. I think we'll see some pushing on softwood lumber. These are some of the longstanding ones that predate the Trump administration by decades, arguably. But there are some newer issues too. I think we'll see some pushes on the digital services tax. As many know, in June of 2024, the Canadian government introduced a 3% digital services tax on foreign service providers, most of which are American: Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. That is retroactive to 2022. The first payment has not come due yet, but it comes due later this year. So I think we'll see pushback on the digital services tax. That is also, by the way, a process that the Canadian government undertook outside of the OECD effort to introduce a global tax in that area. So it's sort of doubly problematic for the United States. Another new issue that I think is going to be pushed in CUSMA review and renegotiation is the Online Streaming Act, which requires, again, mostly American entities, Netflix and others, to fund and broadcast Canadian content. So I think all of these things will be on the table, among others, the access to the telecoms market in Canada. And these are just the trade issues. We haven't talked about some of the non-trade issues that could be linked to the CUSMA renegotiation, and that's a very real issue. It's worth noting, and I'll just end with this, that the Canadian government has already started to prepare for the CUSMA renegotiation. So testimony has been presented to the House Standing Committee on International Trade since I think May of last year. Global Affairs Canada has already put out its call for consultations. So the Canadian government is preparing, but it will be, I think it will be it will not be, it'll be a bumpy ride. It'll be a bumpy ride.
Patty, thank you. McGill, over to you. What are the broad direct impacts of a significant increase in tariffs for Latin American countries? And who will be the most affected here?
Yeah, thank you, Anne, and thank you to Balcelli for the invite. I think the impact will depend on the exposure to the U.S. economy and the nature of the goods these countries export to the U.S., which is entirely different. So if you pick a country like Colombia, who's been in the news maybe for the wrong reasons recently, Colombia exports around 5% of its GDP to the United States. It's $16 to $18 billion a year. Half of that it's oil derivatives, oil-related products. Half of that it's agricultural goods, mostly coffee and flowers. So, I mean, a tariff on Colombian goods on the US will impact the output of this sector, particularly in the case of agricultural goods and coffee. You may assume it's located in rural areas and might impact in a different way that if we talk about Mexico, for instance. Mexico obviously is the country most exposed to the US. It exports 30% of its GDP, $460 billion a year. It's just such a massive figure. Most of those goods are highly sophisticated goods. We're talking about goods that insert into US value chains, vehicles, we're talking about machinery, we're talking about electronics. And some of these goods, depending on the level of code you work on, go back and forth. So there are things that Mexico export that have inputs that have gone from Mexico to the US, assembled and back. So some final goods to produce them, you really need some of the components to go across the border various times. So in the case of Mexico, we're talking of a massive devastating impact. The country is already with a very low growth rate, actually the lowest growth rate for any president of 6-year period in the last 30 years was Manuel López Obrador growth rate. So you're talking about outright recession, but the immediate impacts will not be rural. The immediate impacts would not be on low-skilled workers. The immediate impact would be on the north of Mexico and the more sophisticated regions. It is a threat, you said, of this tariff. Someone pointed out it's a threat. It creates a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty, it's already having an impact. Of course, for the threat to be credible, you need to promise you will self-harm yourself. Otherwise, that would be convenient for you. You would do it anyway. So the nature of a threat is I'm going to hurt you, and to a certain extent, I'm going to hurt myself if you don't do X. So I say this just to talk about impacts on the US economy, which, of course, because of side and trade, like Bob was pointing out, are much smaller. But sometimes they can be located in places that are uncomfortable. For instance, Mexico imports $6 billion a year in yellow corn and imports like $4 billion in soy. Where are these things produced in the US? They are produced mostly in what it's called the yellow corn belt. These are states like Iowa, Indiana, southern Michigan, western Ohio, some of which are Trump strongholds. So yes, the impacts are small countrywide because it's a very large country, but that doesn't mean that some specific populations that incidentally are Trump strongholds will not be affected in the short term. And I'd like to close with a couple of comments on John's point on the obsession with trade deficits. So now the whole world gets the trade deficit of the world by definition with itself has to be zero, right? I mean, you don't trade with Mars. So if every country in the world gets obsessed about the trade deficit, then eventually we will go back to autarky. So we got out of that for the reason. We are better off for the reason. US doesn't produce much textiles for the reason someone does that more efficiently. So the end game of shutting down the trade deficit, it's autarky. And I don't think that's a desirable place where we would like to go. And the second thing I wanted to say is that there's an inconsistency, not in what Bob said, but in the politics that is being implemented. With 4% unemployment, a switch to higher demand in the US market will increase wages. how are you going to produce textiles with higher wages? There's a reason you don't do textiles. Well, the answer can be, well, we do textiles for ourselves. We just don't sell them abroad because they will be utterly uncompetitive. We sell it to ourselves. And I don't think that the overall population will be better off buying textiles produced at US wages. So there's a massive inconsistency on the policy and effects that will, and I haven't talked about retaliation because I know that's coming later. It's a massive inconsistency in the immediate effects and the effects that, I mean, as an economist, you can predict fairly easy in a relatively short time.
Thank you so much. Now, John, come in and tell us about the impacts of US policy globally.
That's again, it's back to this core uncertainty problem. What's William Golden's line? Nobody knows nothing. I mean, I put myself in that category. I would I'd throw a historical anecdote into this. It's a remarkable fact and a sad fact that when the U.S., the 1930-31 Tariff Act, the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which helped, it was such a disastrous contribution to the Great Depression, was making its way through the U.S. Congress, apparently no one really imagined that anyone would retaliate, that you could just do these things and slap a 50% tariff on the world and nothing would happen. And of course, that is the other great unknown. I mean, how is the world going to react to this? There's two schools of thought. There's one school of thought that says, keep a cool head, don't react, turn the other cheek. As Miguel said, it's self-harm, retaliation. And others who say the only way you'll get respect and be treated seriously is if you plan ahead and retaliate. So I think what looks like could be seen as not as significant an economic effect could very quickly, rapidly become a significant economic effect if it translates into kind of an unraveling of trade interdependence and a global trade war. But the flip side of that is the US is not the size it was relative to the world economy today as it was even, 30 years ago, or certainly when Smoot-Hawley was going through. I mean, even the US-China trade relationship is 3% of world trade. It's not that big. So, part of what we're seeing, is a very US-focused debate because everyone has been kind of alarmed by this policy. But for the rest of the world, I'm not so sure they're there. I think they will continue to trade with each other. There is an economic logic in integration. So again, it remains to be seen how countries react to the US, how the US reacts. I mean, whether or not this is more bluff than actuality will depend on the long run effects. But I do tend to think that just what is happening in the US is not necessarily replicated worldwide. If you talk to the middle powers, they're not in a hurry to deglobalize. As a matter of fact, if you go to Asia, they want more globalization, not less. So,
Can I come back to you and pick up on the response to tariffs? So what, in your view, is likely to happen? How can the affected countries react? And what would be the consequences of such responses?
Anne, were you asking me?
No, Miguel, sorry.
Okay.
I mean, talking about irony, John was talking about undusting the books on tariff to review these things. Mexico was super busy last year thinking about nearshoring, meaning like US will demand less from China and Far East Asia and will, to secure more certainty around value chains, start demanding more from Mexico. So that was kind of the thought like a year ago, and many people were working on that. So what you can expect is these countries will try to avoid self-harming themselves. And it will all depend. They will get demands to behave in certain ways, and some of them will agree and some of them will not. Though for those who doesn't, most likely they will retaliate, and that's where the impacts become bigger and and more interesting. But what would these countries do? I don't know. If I were them, I will start searching for new markets for my goods. So there was a point in the 90s where it became fashionable. Forget about regional trade agreements like Mercosur, etc. Let's just go straight and sign a free trade agreement with the US. So right after NAFTA, 11 Latin American countries, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Peru went ahead and signed a bilateral free trade agreement with the US. Well, I guess now in response to this, the first thing I would do is just to go back and look around my neighbors and search for goods for my markets. And the second thing I would do is look up to China, of course. Now, it's interesting that as of today, China is already the main commercial partner. I mean, if you compare it to the US, the only country in South America that has a significant higher relationship with US and China, it's Colombia, incidentally. All other countries, if you add exports and imports, China, it's more important than the US already. And the main commercial partner for most of them, if you take out Argentina, whose main partner, obviously, it's Brazil. Other than that, China has become already the big commercial partner of South America. And I guess a movement towards accentuate that tendency, it's due. So in a certain way, yeah, I guess this is exactly the opposite of what the policy it's aiming at, but I guess it will be the natural reaction. I will start just looking for new markets for my goods, and neighbors and China sound like the most attractive option.
Patty, how should Canada respond to the threat or the implementation actually of tariffs?
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear Miguel's perspective on that. I think we're hearing some of these similar discussions in Canada. Of course, the word that we're hearing most is retaliation. I might be in a minority or perhaps a growing majority. I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous about retaliation, especially when we're talking about dollar for dollar retaliation, and what the Canadian government seems to suggest is somewhat sizable. I'll tell you why I'm nervous. We hear a number of statistics that suggest that our retaliation could have an impact. There's some evidence that perhaps our retaliation in the first Trump administration might have had an impact on Trump's decision-making. That's very difficult to prove. We hear that 34 states sell most of their goods to Canada. We hear that we are the largest export market for U.S. exports. So these are statistics that suggest that we have some power to that retaliatory tariffs from us might have some power. Then we have the statistic that Bob shared earlier about the proportion of the GDP of the US that actually is accounted for by trade. We know that we sell 77% of our exports to the United States. The United States only sells roughly 17% of their exports to us. So I'm not convinced that there's a vulnerability there that we are in a position to exploit. I simply am not convinced that we can win a tariff war with the United States. And it's not only these statistics. One of the challenging things with tariffs is that once you put them on, you've got to figure. It's like having an exit strategy in another situation. When do you lift them? The assumption, or I think the hope, is that we lift them when Trump gives in. What if Trump doesn't give in? I'm assuming that a lot of us are very interested in a document that was published a couple of months ago by a gentleman called Stephen Moran, who is Donald Trump's nominee to lead his Council of Economic Advisors. And Mr. Moran wrote a document called The User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And one of the things he says in that document is about retaliatory tariffs, that if the United States effectively links security to trade, then he says, and I'll quote him, it could declare that it views joint defense obligations and the American defense umbrella as less binding or reliable for nations that implement retaliatory tariffs. So I just think this is a dangerous game for Canada. I think maybe part of what Miguel is suggesting is that there's a more concerted joint effort at retaliation. But I think given our vulnerabilities, it's a very, very risky proposition. And by the way, I think that the Moran piece is very interesting in that it does demonstrate that the playbook that perhaps we've been discussing here about the relationship between tariffs and open trade and prosperity and open trade and peace, it's not the playbook that's underpinning some of this policy thinking. And so that acknowledging that is really important. So retaliation for me is a very worrying strategy in the Canadian context. That leaves, Miguel mentioned diversification. The interesting thing about diversification, and this has been on the Canadian list of policy efforts, certainly since the Nixon shock and probably before. But what we know is that, so we sent 69% of our exports to the United States in 1971 during the Nixon shock. Now we send 77%. And in the intervening period, we have negotiated numerous trade agreements. Canada boasts frequently that we are the only G7 country to have agreements with every other G7 country. So to the degree that diversification means opening up markets through free trade agreements, we have checked that box. But it's very difficult then to get the private sector to follow along and to turn that ship at that other level. And so absolutely, diversification has to remain a critical conversation in the Canadian context, but we probably have to figure out how to do it differently, because the negotiation of free trade agreements has not delivered diversification for us. Last thing I'll say on this, and if it's not retaliation and it's not diversification, then in Canada, what is it? And it's strengthening the domestic economy. And I'm happy to expand on that more, but there are a lot of things that we've got to do, looking domestically, looking inward, to make sure that we have the strongest possible economy that we can have.
Absolutely. Bob, over to you. Trump's tariff threats seem to get the attention of both governments and businesses. Why? And are foreign governments likely to resist or giving in? Is there a more tariff-friendly view in the U.S. business community?
Yeah, so it's very hard to sort that out right now, particularly in the US or any business that's trying to do business in the US. I think everybody's recognized that the way you minimize the uncertainty, and this, Patty's point about uncertainty is really, really important. Businesses absolutely hate it. They want to know, if they're going to make an investment, what the playing field, the economic playing field, is going to look like. Tariffs are one that they have typically been able to assume we're not going to get variation here, right? That's one element in our calculus that should be pretty steady. And then we can deal with all the other market kind of uncertainties that might come along. And the geopolitical elements that are often bigger than the tariff discussions. So this uncertainty is why it gets their attention. It increases their costs. They don't like that. And it increases their immediate costs, but it also can undermine the value of their investments, right? So they make these, they design their supply chains to sort of optimize their cost of production and their profit maximization. And once you start disrupting that, then they think, well, okay, if I've got to diversify, I've got to build a plant, or I've got to make connections with another business, another firm in a different country. Will they be able to meet my contract specifications? How good are their ports? What's the contract law there? There's lots of costs involved with establishing those new connections, and they don't want to incur those costs if they don't have to. So they kind of want to ride this out. And one of the ways to write it out is with someone like President Trump, is to come in and say, we're going to invest in your country. We're going to put billions of dollars here. We're going to put billions of dollars there. They don't sign anything. We saw this with Foxconn in Wisconsin. There's a number of places where we had big announcements. And believe me, you can see President Trump right up there, side by side, making that announcement. But there's very little, in my sense, from my perspective, there's been very little follow through in that. Same with the China deal #1, right? And now they're going to reevaluate that. So I think that's the big thing. It gets our attention because they really don't like the uncertainty. That's businesses. Governments don't like it because their businesses complain to them about it. I do want to comment, though, if I could, going on and respond to Patty a little. So why has it been hard for Canada to diversify? I would say it's economic gravity, right? So there's this concept, many of us know about it. You know, how big your economies are, how close together they are, is a very strong empirical driver of trade flows. And the US has had relatively strong growth compared to many of the partners that you have signed free trade agreements with. And our relationship has been stable. But those costs can go up. So the idea is that it's relatively low cost. What Trump is doing is saying, I'm going to raise those costs, right? And if that starts to happen, and if the US economy starts to slow, I think it increases the opportunities and the potential from diversification, particularly if many other countries are looking at economic gravity in Asia, basically saying, wow, I think that's going to be more stable. I think those costs are going to continue to fall. They're investing in ports. They're investing in my ports. You know, so far the contract law, although Australia could complain a bit about this, has, you know, the legal framework has been pretty stable. So I think economic gravity is pretty useful to consider in this context, and think about how the Trump trade policies and any retaliation affect in an economic gravity framework. I mean, I've used CGE models. They kind of reflect economic gravity, but economic gravity is a different conceptual way to look at it. The other thing, last point on this, look at what happened to global trade with Russia-Ukraine invasion. Initial high spikes in prices, lots of sanctions, a lot of redirected trade. If there's anything the global trading system is really good at, is you might lose your flour market to the United States, and it may be hard to replace it completely, but you can find other sources, right? And it may take a little while to do that, but you may want to diversify if that core partner of yours is pretty unstable. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So Patty, just on the relationship between US and Canada, is this a turning point for our relations? Is the special relationship dead or on its way down?
So that's an interesting question, but I appreciate your analysis, Bob, and I hope you're right that maybe the incentive structure will allow us to mine the diversification strategy to a greater degree. On the U.S.-Canada relations, so I'd say a couple of things about that. One, and I say this as somebody who's lived in the United States for 23 years, we talk about the U.S.-Canada relationship in certain terms. I think sometimes in Canada, we see the U.S. that we want to see. I'm not sure we have always have the sort of understanding of some of the currents in the United States that lead to a moment like this. So I think as we're thinking about US-Canada relations, I think there's some value in curiosity about where these sorts of very real and enduring trends have come from. The other thing I would say is that I think we've probably overstated the degree to which we have a special relationship with the United States, and to our detriment. I think, as I said, I think many of us are looking back at the Nixon shock, and I was rereading something that Nixon said in speaking to Parliament in 1972, where you would expect everybody to be bringing their most positive view, and he said that basically we need to move beyond the sentimental rhetoric. And there's a way in which we have probably focused a little too much on we're friends, we're brothers, we share the border, et cetera. And I think we can probably bring a little bit more of a clear-eyed, I'm not sure what the word is, not harsher, but maybe a bit more hard-headed assessment of that relationship, which I think would probably serve us better than the more positive sense that we have this special relationship. I'm not sure that's always served us.
And Miguel, what about the indirect impacts, like the effects on income, labor, migration flows on the targeted countries?
Yeah, well, income might be negative. Let me just share with you, in Mexico, there's a certain caution and some optimist people. Sometimes I count myself among the optimists, and then I switch later on in the day. But I mean, it would be such a blow for the US economy in a certain way in terms of prices, disruption of value chains, etc., that many people think that what the US might be after with threatening Mexico with tariff is Chinese companies that have been investing in Mexico to take advantage of the free trade agreement. We've been doing some work at our school on that. As you know, tracking firm ownership for research, it's something that it's really hard, but that might be something that might be at the core. I think in the short term, the consequences will be a price increase. Price increases tend to have redistributional effects. So I would say for firm owners, a sharp price increase might not necessarily be a bad thing. Obviously, for consumers, it is. And I think that will happen in Latin America. It might happen a recession cope with a price increase that might destabilize some governments and cause switches in a region that has been already going back and forth around the center right and center left. In the medium term, I guess it will depend on the capacity of the US to substitute some of these imports you're aiming at curbing down with tariffs. And I think that's an unknown. Like Bob said, there will be more incentives, but there's also a lot of inconsistency in going structural transformation to the -1. Now you're moving employment to low-wage sectors, which doesn't sound feasible. If this remains in the long term, I will tend to think this will lead to a realignment of trade interests along the lines that we've been talking to. And one thing, yeah, trade, it moves fast, like Bob was saying, but within firms, these decisions are made one every X years. And I think where you put your plan, where you send your investment, where you establish initial trade connections is a lot more sticky. So if this remains in time, it will lead to a significant realignment of the trade as we know it today, and about trade and political alliances as well. Migration flows, it can only be negative negative and positive migration, considering that negative. Countries being harmed economically, associating that to less migration, I don't see how that can happen. If you become extremely effective at controlling the inflows, yeah, that might lead to zero, but certainly not less migration than it's happening now. And we've been seeing through the Darien Strait through Panama, as we speak, the flow of immigrants through Darien, Central America on their way to US hasn't slowed down since the beginning of the year. It continues to occur at a significant pace. And if the economy deteriorates, I guess it will increase.
Bob, what are some of the more dynamic, likely longer-term effects of the Trump tariffs?
I think Miguel just laid out some very nice ones, right? I think what you'll see is the U.S. will become a much higher, an island of much higher cost production than it historically has been. I think, I didn't talk about this, but we ran a deportation scenario, right? The negative effects on the U.S. economy are much bigger because you're removing not just a chunk of labor, but a chunk of GDP that has demand, right? And so that's really bad. The thing we didn't ask is what happens to that labor when it gets deported. So we don't know. Miguel was talking about maybe what's happening in other countries. We didn't look at that. The dynamic effects are, I think, a less innovative, smaller scale economy, higher cost, more isolated, less knowledge spillovers. And I think a much greater significant risk of financial crisis. It's not clear when you look at the tax and macroeconomic policies that Trump has laid out, that's going to actually reduce the deficit. In fact, CBO predicts it will increase the deficit. And if other countries are viewing us as not a great partner and less dynamic and growing less fast, then those foreign direct investment flows are going to decline. We have a significant imbalance in domestic savings and investment. It just, there could be a path through this, deregulation, lowering those costs. Although the size of that kind of thing historically is small compared to these other things that I've been talking about. Fiscal policy response, if things slow down, prices rise, he's going to want to increase the deficit, write checks and sign them to US households. We saw that was inflationary in COVID-19. He's going to pressure the Fed to accommodate that. That's going to undermine the confidence in the US dollar. That could be good for our trade deficit, but if everybody's unhappy trading with the US, and anyway, to me, it looks kind of like a very complex macroeconomic environment. And frankly, the trade stuff is a contributor. Maybe it's the match that lights the fuse. But the big explosive stuff really is the macro finance stuff. And the trade stuff is sort of like a death by 1,000 mosquito bites.
Dawn, how about the WTO? How is this going to affect your organization?
That's, it's a tough one to comment on. And I just a couple of observations, and then I throw a guess out there. And again, we're back into this world of just huge uncertainty and very low visibility. One thing I do worry about, I have two. I have a macro worry and a micro worry. My micro worry is about trade agreements. It's one thing to say, we're going to renegotiate a trade agreement or we're going to update a trade agreement. But at some point, when people just walk away from trade agreements or just completely violate them, they're not worth the paper they're written on. And I think I worry about that in terms of a rules-based international system, and not just in trade. We don't have a global police force. There's no global court that can bring countries to dock for breaking the rules. The rules only work because everyone lives by the rules. And the moment a giant power says, these rules, they don't really matter. You can renegotiate it. You can do another set of rules, but it's a bit like a skyscraper after an earthquake. It looks like it's still standing, but in fact, it's deeply fragile and structurally unsound. So all this talk about new agreements, that worries me. My macro worry is really is where Bob and I came from and what we spent our careers doing. I really worry right now that the world has no collective purpose, shared collective purpose. And not just on things like economic growth and development. It goes to the environment. I see it in the G20. There's just what we used to believe was a kind of a convergence of ideals and policies has now become a divergence. And where does that leave us? So my thought, and this is not WTO, this is a scenario thing. With really no knowledge and low visibility, I think there's three scenarios I can see taking shape. One, that the global rules-based order is weakened, if not fatally weakened. And we find ourselves in a world of regional spheres of influence. And what we'll really see develop is just a growing concentration of a constellation of powers around the great powers, China, EU, and the US. God knows where India will fit. And for Canada, that Canada has to get real about this. I mean, I don't think I see Canada's sovereignty increasing out of this. I just don't see any scenario in that world. And I would point out that, it was only a few months ago during the Biden administration that the United States slaps 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. What does Canada do? Do we not slap tariffs? Oh God, no, that's not a possibility. Do we slap 80% tariffs or 120? No, we do exactly what the US did. I mean, this was our sovereign response. We just fall in line. So this erosion of kind of Canada's independence has been going on longer than Donald Trump. And is this going to be some kind of gravitational pull to accentuate that? Anything that comes out of this negotiation, I don't see our sovereignty increasing. I see it decreasing. The other scenario is different. The second scenario is that the rules-based system, is fragile and weakens. But instead of great powers emerging and consolidating their spheres of influence, it's a kind of a free-for-all. And middle powers play a la carte trade policy. They play the big powers off against each other, and they maximize their benefits as far as they can. In which case, it's a kind of a diversion, an a la carte diversification policy on steroids. And again, I can see plausible explanations for that. When you go to Brazil, for example, Brazil talks openly about the worries about a rules-based system, but they're benefiting enormously from China-US standoff. It's been really good for them. It's been good for Singapore. It was up till recently good for Korea. You know, they're doing well out of playing the big guys off each other. And certainly Africa sees it in a really good sense. They think this is a new Cold War and they will just go with the highest bidder. The last one is the most utopian of all. You know, rules, everyone thought a rules-based order was boring until now. And now we're suddenly waking up and going, wow, those rules were actually really important. It's like, you know, how could you play a hockey game if there were no rules and no referees? And we kind of feel like we're in a hockey game with no rules and referees. Do we come out of this crisis 4 years from now and start re-examining the whole of the international system, not just the trade, but the security, the macroeconomics, and especially the environment, and say, you know, that 75-year-old or 80-year-old system just isn't working. We need a new system. If I were sitting in global affairs, I would be thinking about that, but I don't think that's going to happen over the next 4 years.
Well, I want to push on that final point and give you all 15 seconds, bearing in mind that there are policymakers in the audience with us today. What is your advice to them? John, continue.
What is my advice to the policymakers?
Yes.
I think if they're foreign policymakers or trade policymakers, I always remember the IMF. We had colleagues, Bob and I, in the IMF, and when things were going really well at the IMF, it was bad news. They laid people off, they pensioned them off, and a crisis was actually really good news. You know, they rehired them. There was a flurry of meetings. You know, sadly, and I think it's probably a perverse incentive system for the foreign policy and trade policy establishment, they've never been more in demand, right? People want to know what the hell's going on. There's lots of meetings, lots of talk. So keep to your studies, and you're in a really hot area right now.
Okay, great. McGill, what's your advice?
Actually a world where people are looking for insights.
Thank you, McGill.
Yeah, I think an advice we got from the ground this past week is do not respond to this thread fast on Twitter and in deep late hours of the night. So that would be one. Like it's an anecdote, but it's important that these things are the response is weighted. I get Patty's point on retaliation. Might not necessarily be the best answer for a country. And another thing I would do, given that the demands that are going to be made for some countries, we can predict they're going to be similar, it's just try to meet and see if there would be a collective response from the region to what it's been asked. And of course, the region, it's a lot of governments that do not speak to each other, like the Argentinian one and the Colombian one. But if I were a president, I would use, or policymaker would be looking for allies so that the response to the threat is not mine, but it's a group of people.
Great. Patty, what's your advice?
Well, it's tough. I sympathize with the policymakers that are in the position of trying to navigate this. In Canada, of course, we're about to enter likely an electoral cycle federally. We are in an electoral cycle in Ontario. That does not lend itself to the sort of reflection and analysis that is probably best suited to this. That doesn't mean that can't perhaps go on in other areas, like among policymakers and government. But I think we need to recognize the gravity of the moment. We need to mobilize the best minds to figure out how to build a strong Canadian economy and maybe shift our focus from what is Trump going to do to what are we going to do.
Great. And Bob, finish us off. What's your advice to the policy world?
Well, recognize who you're negotiating with and what his objective functions are. It's not necessarily tariffs being negotiated against tariffs. Sometimes there's other things. Keep that in mind. And also recognize that I think for this particular administration, the U.S. losing less than other trading partners is a win, right? So both sides are losing, but who loses least is viewed as a win. So I think for the longer term, it means probably doing something that's probably good for your own economy and for the world economy, and that's thinking about diversification of your trade partners. I would say try to inoculate yourself as much as possible from the current negotiating leverage that has developed over the past couple decades, and think about in this new perhaps more realist world of international negotiations. It's always had that element anyway, but that you're pragmatic and you do think about diversifying your risks against some of that efficiency.
Great. Thank you all so much. You are all so brilliant. And I know I'm speaking on behalf of the audience when I say that we all learned so much from that. Thank you for being with us. To the audience, if you enjoyed what you saw today, we have events like this regularly. So please sign up if you're not already signed up to our weekly bulletin and come and join us again in the future. Thanks to everybody. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.